Hi, everybody. This is Dan Libenson from Jewish Live, and this is a pilot episode of a show that I have just started. We just started talking about it with my friend here, Yehonatan Shadmi, and are calling it Stone News. And since in many ways this was Yonatan's idea, I want to turn it over to you to talk a little bit about what we're doing here and what the name means.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks. Um, Good morning in Chicago. It's the afternoon here. We're in Bnei Brak. If people don't know, that's an ultra-Orthodox city in Israel. So yeah, Stone News is basically about the spiritual side of current affairs, of current events. And what I hope that we'll do here is sort of help people put stuff in that perspective. Which I think quite amazingly is still, at least in my mind, to the sort of people who would listen to Jewish life, it's still kind of missing. It's still kind of, I think we modern people, it's really hard for us to integrate the spiritual perspective without feeling kind of weird. So yeah, sorry.
No, it's I mean, for listeners, like, this is interesting, right? Live TV, you gotta develop your rhythms.
Yeah. So I guess let's start with the quarantine, obviously. Let's
Yeah.
start with what we're all going, or to different degrees, what we're going through these days. What's the quarantine like situation in Chicago right now?
Well, it's interesting because for two reasons, in some ways, I feel like I'm not the best one to report about it because number one, we live in the south side of Chicago, so it's not the part of Chicago where all the big businesses are and all the big buildings. And so like I haven't seen for myself because we've been on, I think our family pretty much went on lockdown earlier than everybody did. And so I feel like there was a movie, I don't remember what it's called, but it was with Alicia Silverstone, and it's like this family that goes down to their bunker that they had for the for the apocalypse, and they thought that it was the apocalypse, but it was really something else that was happening. And so they went into this bunker, and then they kind of came out, however many years later, 20 years later, and it turned out there never really was an apocalypse, but they didn't know. And that's kind of how I feel. Like I've been, in the bunker longer than most of the people, so I'm not totally sure what's going on. And the other reason is that even before this, I worked at home and did a podcast, not video. But in some ways, like my life hasn't changed all that much from a day-to-day work standpoint, except that now my family is also home. So it feels weird. When we go out to walk the dog or we go walking around, it feels almost a little post-apocalyptic. Actually, there was a few years ago, they were filming in Chicago. Well, I didn't know they were filming in Chicago. I was taking my son to camp, and it was in downtown Chicago, and we came up from the subway, and all of a sudden we looked around and there was no cars on the street, and all these cars were overturned and smoking, and we didn't know what was going on. And it turned out they were filming the Transformers movie. And that's kind of how it feels a little bit, except without the smoking, burning cars.
So your first thoughts that day were something horrible happened? You thought that the cars actually were, I don't know, being bombed?
I don't think I really thought that, but I think that it momentarily it felt like that. I mean, it felt like something insane had happened, and very quickly I could kind of see that they must be filming a movie. But um, it was a very strange feeling to come out from the subway into this place that's usually bustling, and it really felt like a total disaster type of landscape. And in some ways, that my neighborhood is now sort of empty in a way that
Yeah,
it normally isn't.
it is. Are people following sort of the undeclared rules?
It seems to be, at least in this neighborhood. I mean, this is the University of Chicago neighborhood, so there's also a lot of people that are already have left and gone home. And when we walk the dog, it does seem like there's just many fewer people on the street. When I go out at night to walk the dog, there's almost nobody on the street, almost no cars. It's not usually a very high traffic kind of place, but still, it's remarkably different than it usually is.
Mm-hmm.
How about
Here,
you?
here stuff just got real kind of yesterday, where sort of became law that you can't walk the street And I have two daughters, and I was like really, we had some kind of quarantine here for a while, um, and I kept sort of, kind of, kind of not following the rules and taking them like to social gatherings, but uh, but yesterday it became real. And this morning I tried to take them to a playground right next to our house, and a police car came by, and people that have experience with police know this. They kind of slowed down next to us. So I took them, and I took my daughters, and we went back home. And right
Hmm.
now, my wife is taking them to a different place, to a friend's place, and we were discussing like what to do if the police pulls you over. Is it okay? Is it not okay?
Wow.
Um, but so so like taking I'm using the word spiritual here like in the broadest possible sense. I mean, it's a problematic word. It's a word that, at least to me, it can kind of makes you itch, um, like thinking new age stuff, which is fine, but I think I'll just demonstrate. So if we're thinking of the coronavirus in sort of spiritual terms, so one thing, you know what, even before that, we spoke about like the physical side of it, which is a good place to start. And then we may think about like, how do we really feel? And I have to say that a lot of people around me, and maybe myself included, actually feel pretty good, feel better than they did before. I wonder if it's the same for you.
Yeah, I mean, it's weird. Like I have kind of a split experience of it. On the one hand, because we had this notion of jumping in and creating Jewish Live, I'm working harder than I've ever worked before, probably, and I'm working more intensely, like from the moment I wake up till pretty late at night. I'm just working, 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 and so in that sense, I feel very sort of full of adrenaline and in a certain way like full of joy because it's work that I actually like and that it's very meaningful to me and it's fun and I feel like I'm helping people in some way. And then when I'm done, and kind of check the news for the day and talk to my wife, and you just sort of see the unfolding scale of the disaster. And then I kind of look back on my day and I feel like maybe I had a little bit too much of a chipper tone, and maybe that's helpful to people. I hope that it is, but I don't think it's helpful to just spend the day, especially on the air, in some kind of morose fashion. And somehow I think because I'm working so hard, I'm not dwelling on it. But then there's this kind of whiplash at the end of the day where everything's negative and everything's scary and everything is sad.
Yeah, so you get the whiplash when you sort of see TV, or like when you get back to
Yeah,
what,
well,
what
when my wife starts sharing articles with me, and numbers, and when I start to hear, I look on Facebook and start to see that people that I know have the virus and are doing okay so far. Nobody that I know is terribly sick, but um, it's real. It makes it real.
yeah, it seems, yeah. So you're saying once it becomes real, then maybe the cheaper tone kind of changes. I think there's something in emergencies that for certain types under certain conditions, like for me, it's like my wife told me yesterday. She sort of complimented me on how we've been handling it, and I realized that I didn't even. It just cleans everything, right? Emergencies tend to sort of not necessarily focusing on what's important, but just, I don't know, I found myself much less occupied with myself, for example, in ways that aren't productive since the virus, because you have other stuff to do, it would seem.
Yeah, and it's weird. Like I don't know how to feel about it, right? I'm really struggling with it because on the one hand, I think I should feel just bad all the time. Like I think that's the right way to be.
I should feel bad all the time. That's
No,
a
meaning
great.
like if you had a loss. I mean, and I know also this isn't how we really. I mean, Judaism in particular, right? We have a shiva when somebody dies, and people come and visit to console you. But it's not meant to be this time when you're just sitting around and crying. Although in some subcultures of Judaism, I think maybe it's more like that. But at least in my subculture of like Ashkenazi Jews, it tends to
Mhm.
be telling old funny stories about the person who died and jokes and just kind of creating a somewhat of a lighter atmosphere. And so, on the one hand, I feel like it's reasonable that I shouldn't be just going around in this like really sad and negative space. And again, like to the extent that what we're doing here is trying to help people, then, we're not doing comedy, and maybe that would be a good idea. Like maybe we should have some comedians on too. But it doesn't, but it feels like to some extent I don't think people for the most part want to watch that. And so I think it's okay. And on the other hand, I think when we're talking about spirituality and like the deep side of it, I do feel like I have some guilt feelings about not being as present in the tragedy of it as potentially I should be.
I think I think the word present here is really the key, because um, I'm going to say something very general and maybe a little bit shallow, but generally in life, when you're present, your experience becomes really sort of idiosyncratic, really personal, and really real. And like in my mind, if we can accept that the world is good and that we're good, then 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 your authentic experience is the thing that needs to happen. And sort of like what you're talking about, like you're an ideal example right now with Jewish Life, right? Like it could have sort of sent you into some sort of depression and anxieties and fear, and instead you created something that is obviously helping and is useful for others. And specifically with the corona, it's such a literal metaphor. It seems to be a literal metaphor for the isolation and the anxiety and the boredom that we all feel, like most of us. I know I do. The modern person, and we talked about it like it's there's Borges, the Argentinian writer, which I really love, and he said that life is like bad literature, in the sense that you get really like raw metaphors. So Corona really sort of, I guess, for me at least, it's really sending me towards what's called the desert of the real. Like, okay, so there's no real work anymore. I mean, there is some, but there's no, you're just there.
It's interesting. Well, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about what bad metaphor it's really erasing for you. Because it's interesting, like just on your topic about like what I'm doing, like I think that part of why we're doing Jewish Live, why we started doing it, is because somehow we were responding to the cancellation of all the Jewish events in America. Not to, the tragedy hadn't quite happened yet. The people weren't dying on huge numbers yet when we started Jewish Live. And what we were reacting to was that there was going to be no Jewish experiences that people could have. And also that there was going to be this social isolation, because we saw that the shutdowns were coming, that people were staying at home. And so we thought that we wanted to try to work on that problem. And I think we got so full working on that problem that right, we haven't had the time to sort of dwell on the tragedy of it. And I think that that's good, meaning like that I think that if we had started it, if we'd thought about starting it a week later, I wonder if we I wonder if we would have started it, because we would have been in a different headspace. And so so that's just to that point that you made. But I'm curious about when you talked about sort of Borges and the bad metaphors that this is raising, like what is in your mind?
Well, like even before that, just to sort of relate to what you say that it pushed you towards action. And I think, in a Jewish space, it's interesting to sort of, and I feel free saying it because I think I'm like that. People who tend to overanalyze stuff. It's interesting when we have something that pushes us towards action. Mm-hmm. When something positive like that happens, we talked earlier, this is a 50-minute show. It's going to be a little bit like therapy maybe sometimes. Mm-hmm. So it's worth to sort of pause and say, okay, so I'm a person who tends to analyze and maybe even overanalyze. And here's something supposedly bad that pushed me towards sort of, I don't want to say where I need to be, but yeah, in a way. Mm-hmm. And in terms of the metaphor that comes to life, and this has to do with the joy, although this is sort of a darker side of the joy that, I don't know if exactly joy, but some kind of uplifting feelings that we're feeling when we're seeing a metaphor that comes to life. We're seeing our feelings before coronavirus of isolation and perhaps fear, and anxiety sort of come to life, right? It's like there's
Hmm.
a new god, or a new, if we were living in mythological times, like a new monster, the corona monster. And a monster is usually, according to Jung and many before him, it's something that we feel inside that's sort of being manifested. And with the corona, it's so, again, it's so, and people are dying, right? But
Yeah.
artistically, it's so beautiful. I just read that the whole virus is like 8 kilobytes,
Huh.
which in computer terms, it's
Right.
less than one image. It's less
Right.
than a word, like a file of a word page of a single word page. And that's so poetic in a
Uh-huh.
way. There's
Right.
something in us, I think, that responds to that.
Right. I mean, there's so many ways to go with that. One of the things that it sort of raises for me is that I feel like for the last 4 years, as we've been doing the Judaism Unbound podcast, we've been talking about um, the ways in which people are changing, the experience of being human is changing, and maybe Judaism needs to change in certain ways in order to be valuable. And what I tend to mean by Judaism needs to change is that what I call the user interface of Judaism needs to change, right? The deep wisdom, and I want to talk about that with you because I think it goes to this question of the mythology in certain ways. This deep wisdom, which I think is still and always will be relevant because I think it's actually really good and I think it's really solid. But the user interface, like how we access that wisdom, has been not working as well, I think, for many reasons. But we've tended to talk about the idea that most, at least American Jews, are sort of high up on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and some of the ways that the user interface of Judaism has been designed are more for people that are lower on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I've also associated that with Yuval Noah Harari's book Homo Deus, and the idea that in many ways human beings are becoming more God-like. That doesn't mean that they're becoming God, but it means that a lot of the ways that we used to talk about God are actually more relevant to us maybe than they are to God, in the sense that we were praying to God, this powerful being, to save our lives, to save the world, and then it turns out that we're causing climate change. We're causing death. We're not helping poor people. So all that stuff that we used to turn towards God, it's actually dysfunctional to now turn towards God for that stuff because we have the power to do those things. And now maybe we should figure out how to relate towards people who turn toward us. And for example, we have the mythological idea in Judaism of walking in God's ways. So maybe we should think about how we would behave if we behave more like God. All that I still agree with and everything. But the corona situation also shows how totally vulnerable we still are, right? And how, whether it's to God or to an 8 kilobyte a piece of genetic material, there are ways in which we are absolutely at the mercy of nature and of other forces that in ways that still really matter.
Well, I really love that, and I want to build on that. I want to sort of suggest, you're saying, well, maybe we're a bit like God these days. And it's like there are, let's go like pre-monotheism times. It's like there are many gods inside us. And as you were talking and I was listening to you, I kind of felt the fear. I felt the fear in my body. I said, hey, this guy's right. Danny's right. There's a lot of bad stuff that can happen that we can do. And while this is sort of, it can lead you towards a path of feeling pretty weak, it can also lead you towards a path of feeling pretty strong, because there are gods inside you, inside all of us.
Mm-hmm.
Gods, again, we can call it whatever we want.
Mm-hmm.
But those sort of, or monsters or heroes, and we sort of have access to them. And like, it's common to say that in modern times that's not the case, and we no longer think of ourselves as sort of being able to be inhabited by those forces. But in fact, in the physical world, we're more, like you said, we're more godlike and more monster-like than we ever were. And I don't know, at the very least, it feels exciting.
Interesting. I mean, like the other metaphor that I wanted to explore, and you said something earlier that I didn't quite catch, but you said something about the desert or the wilderness, and um, as one of the things that you were quoting, and I've been thinking a lot about metaphor in a slightly different way. I mean, you were saying that maybe in a way the coronavirus is like a new metaphor, a new kind of monster. And I think that that's right. And I think that it would be really interesting to mine some of our old stories about monsters to also know what to do. But I think about metaphor, or I think about mythology. This is kind of, this, I'm no Joseph Campbell, but this is the way that like I think about mythology in my mind, is that mythology or wisdom are stories that help us transmit wisdom over the generations, and that wisdom is basically something that you generally can only learn through the school of hard knocks. But
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
ideally, but if you learn it through the school of hard knocks, it's often too late. So for example, how to be a good parent. It would be better if you knew how to be a good parent before you became a parent, rather than learning on the job, which means that you make a lot of mistakes. And like we were saying, this is like a therapy session. Maybe you end up sending your kids to therapy, right? Because you made all
Yeah,
these mistakes. So it would be better if somehow you knew how to be a good parent. And one way is to like have a great role model in your own parents or some other parent. And another is to have stories of amazing parenting that you kind of internalize. And so you kind of know what to do when the situation presents itself, even though you don't even know why you know what to do. And I want to suggest, or at least explore the possibility that we have mythologies about what to do in times of great upheaval like this. In Judaism in particular, which I think about the most, I think about the story of the Exodus. And so to me, what it feels to me like, it's almost like on the nose, right? That there was a plague, and that forced us to migrate to
yeah.
a new place.
Too
In this
literal.
case, what?
It's too literal.
It's really literal. I mean, it's so, but we're migrating to a new place. In this case, it's the internet, cyberspace, right? And right now, it's the period right after the Exodus, and we are just totally, flailing around because, of course, we're so discombobulated, and some people aren't even aware that we've really left a place yet, and they kind of imagine that we're going back very soon. We're only here, actually, it's even in the Bible. It talks about how, Moses asked the Pharaoh to just go for 3 days to worship God, like we're going to come
Yeah,
back,
yeah,
and I wonder if that was just for the Pharaoh's benefit, or like the people also believe that, and
yeah. And it's
and
special.
yeah, and so like I feel now like that if we look at those stories deeply, and other stories from other mythologies, like maybe they sort of tell us what to do, and in a way, what I'm thinking, at least in terms of the Jewish story, is the idea of building the Mishkan, which is the tabernacle, the temporary sort of structure, in this case a temporary temple. But the point is that I think a lot of people are oriented towards saying, almost like, how can we like preserve all of our things that we were doing before this Exodus? And some people, and I think we're among them, are saying we might be here for a very long time, and we may not actually sort of want to go back to the way things were afterwards. So let's actually build some new structures in this temporary wilderness. We know the structures we're building in the wilderness are not the structures that are going to stay around forever, but maybe they get us a little closer to those. And that's a whole area of work. So I don't know, like, I think on some deep level also, that's what's driving me to do what we're doing now, is some notion that, like, I think this is what we're supposed to do in a time like this.
So that really resonates with me. And the question that takes me to which is the big question, I think, with Jewish resources and arguably religious resources in general. How do we take all those stuff that you just so beautifully illustrated and make it more than an intellectual idea? More than, this is usually my sort of problem with most of Parashat HaShavua, which most of
Right.
the Torah portion.
Right.
That even if it's a brilliant Torah portion, you say, well, okay, that's a neat idea.
Right.
And I think the way to do it is, first of all, you do need to do what you just did. You need to structure a good story and show sort of the equivalencies. But then to internalize it, it's not but, just to internalize it. So there are two things that I think are useful. And I was kind of going through them as you were talking. The first is our body. Our body is immensely useful in sort of letting new information come in. And I'm going to use here the word penetrate, letting new information penetrate you and really change you, rather than saying, well, here's a neat idea. And I think this is a huge challenge for almost all non-Orthodox and also Orthodox Jews. How do we make these stories more like what they used to be? Because they used to be something that you would, there's a story, who was the person? Yehezkel, I think, right? Yehezkel, God told him, eat the scroll. He told him to physically eat the scroll that he was where the words
Right.
of God born.
Right.
So that's one thing. Use the body. I don't really know exactly how, but that's one thing. And the other thing, again, as you were talking, and I was sort of saying, sort of lowering my defenses and saying, okay, so let's say this is true. And I was feeling the fear. I was feeling the fear. And even before the hope, like another thing that I think is not constructive is go to solutions. Let's feel the fear, let's feel the wilderness, and allow it to sort of take over us in a way.
Right. I mean, it's interesting because I feel like different people do different things, and that's part of that's just part of it, right? And on the one hand, I feel like I have a tendency to go intellectual for sure, and there's a role for that. I mean, like if everybody just went straight to fear, then nobody would be saying, "Wait, how are we going to get out of this?" You know. And so there's something to be said about that. I also think that there's you know, like like we shouldn't be judging, right? People will take. I'm not saying you're judging. I'm just saying like when a situation like this comes about,
Yeah.
um, I think I don't know quite how to put it, and maybe there's sort of a therapy way to put it, you know, that says like what we need to do is help people be themselves in the most functional way, like in the least dysfunctional way. So if you're a person who tends to be a feeler of strong emotions, for example, then maybe in a time like this, I guess this is my question from a sort of psychological standpoint, like maybe we should say like, yeah, so you should go into that in this time because this is a time when it's worthy. Or maybe that person we want to counsel to help them, you know, maybe feel a little bit less because they're going to be stuck, where somebody like me who tends to go intellectual, maybe the therapy that I need is to say, okay, well, that's fine, and yes, you are going to help us get out of this in the end, but maybe you should sit with your feelings a little bit more. It would be good for you.
Well, I think one way to describe it, so you have a strong intellectual side. We don't want to cancel it. If anything, we maybe even want to double down on it. But again, arguably, according to what I call sort of the spiritual side, you want to make sure that your intellect is really at the service of whatever it is that you're going through. Because what you're going through personally and collectively, that's the guide. That's like the role of reality. The role of reality is to show you how to use the stuff that you have inside you in the best way, in the most effective way. And we don't have to go into it, but just to say that there's a whole, much of it is outside of Judaism. There's a lot of thinking, tens of thousands of years old, some of it, if you're accepting sort of images as a way of thinking.
Right.
It goes exactly into that. So I'll just give one example. One way to think about what's going on inside you is like you have different voices, different heroes, different monsters inside you. And there's like one metaphor that I use a lot, which is a family metaphor. You have an internal father, and you have an internal mother, and you have an internal child. And there's also sort of internal others. And the way to make sense out of all of this mess is reality. Reality and the body. The body is sort of the best introduction to reality. If you're being, God forbid, punched or hugged, there's something undeniable about that. And that's a really good guide to sort of go forward, I think.
So can you be practical? So what does that mean when you say that? Like, what do you sort of imagine a person would actually do to embrace what you're saying?
Okay, so I think that's a good segue to our next, to the next thing that we wanted to talk about, which is money, which I think it's really important to talk about at times like this. People are going to have, already are having, I think, really hard time. A lot of people are losing their jobs, which is like the most stressful thing ever, basically, or one of the most. I think it's like one below losing a close family member. And it's going to be huge, I think, in the coming weeks. And one way to think about that is, according to some traditions, there's a whole chakra system, right? It's fairly well known by now that our bodies have sort of different energy points, and you don't have to believe all that stuff. It just, if it's useful for you. And according again to some of those traditions, the chakra of money is in the end of the spine, basically near our butt, or in the perineum, which is right between our sexual organs and our butt. And this is the chakra of money. The root chakra, a chakra of other things, it's it's like it has to do with security and with our basic needs. If you talked about Maslow, this is before sort of the higher needs.
Right.
Whatever grounds you to stability in your life, like food, water, shelter, safety, that stuff. And when livelihood is threatened, that's what's being threatened. And in Hebrew, we say Yoshev Tov. You say on a person that has like enough money that they sit well, that they well sit. And so, as this sort of somewhat financial tsunami is already hitting or about to hit many of us, what I would sort of suggest is not going straight to the solution. Allow the fear to inhabit you without destroying you, and sort of trusting your internal mechanism to do the work. And just, I think I'm going to do just that for a moment.
Okay.
It's scary, man. Scary. It's I think many of us are feeling that the world, like politically, is not necessarily in very good hands in Israel or in the US. Oh, I'm almost trembling. But again, like with the corona, there's something joyful. Like it's so much. It feels nice. Feeling the fear feels nice, at least for me.
It's interesting. Like, I don't know if this is connected to, but back to sort of feelings, and we were talking about like what feelings we're feeling before. I'm struggling a little bit with a feeling of, I guess I'd call it betrayal, maybe, in the sense that meaning that I feel like betrayed by the government, and I'll tell you how. That, I mean, there's a lot of ways, but I'm actually not talking about the way that everybody's talking about. I'm saying that, like, imagine that extraterrestrials came to visit Earth, and it was like a war. It was like War of the Worlds. It was terrible. And it turned out that the government knew that in Area 51, there were extraterrestrials. Like, the government knows now, right? Which a lot of people say, but the government knows that actually there are extraterrestrials, and they have visited Earth, and they are warlike, and they are something to fear, right? And they knew, but we didn't know. And then all of a sudden they invade Earth, and all of a sudden we're dealing with an extraterrestrial invasion, and like we don't really know what to do, and we're shocked and we're upset. That's how I feel with the coronavirus, because it turns out that now that you read these articles, that, for example, in every time there's a new president in the US, they have these tabletop games where they kind of tell them what are the big things that we're afraid of, and here's how we think about like dealing with them. And it turns out that there was a whole game plan about how to deal with a global pandemic, and it does involve this social distancing, or what we're now more calling physical distancing, because we're trying not to call it social distancing, because actually, and this is something we can maybe talk about later, but like because of the internet and things like this, we actually can have a pretty rich social experience, a different one, but a rich one nonetheless. But this whole idea that we would be, stuck in our homes for months was a known thing to the government, and I never heard of it before. Now maybe I'm ill-informed or whatever, but I feel like I'm a little bit unprepared to deal with this, and I think most of us are, because we just didn't really ever know that this was a possibility until all of a sudden it happened a week or two ago. And I don't know, maybe there's not a better way, but I sort of think about it as like back in the 50s, when they did know that there was a fear that the Russians would attack us with nuclear missiles and everything, that they did these drills, where you would go under your desk. I mean, a lot of good that would do, but at least the society was kind of prepared for the idea that something like this could happen. And they kind of had a little bit of a sense of, if it does happen, here's what we would do. But I don't feel we had any of that. And I don't blame Donald Trump specifically for that. I blame Donald Trump specifically for a lot of things, but like, I don't think I think the whole, meaning like this was known for decades by the government, that this would be the response to a situation like this, and I don't think any of us ever knew about it.
I think, or I believe, like what you're describing is, and everything that we're going through right now can be described as another aspect of the crumbling of our government, as the sort of breaking down of our system. And there's a lot of people who've been saying, mostly like you mentioned conspiracy theories and many sort of extreme right wings, as we're saying, but even not so extreme people like Peter Thiel, the well-known investor and he's a Trump supporter, that our institutions are corrupt and are dysfunctional. And even with like, before we say whether this is true or not, I think it's okay to just be with this. It's not even a fact, but this notion. And again, not let it destroy us, because I think, okay, so here's the answer. So here's what we should do. Here's how we should, change our institutions. Let's wait a little bit. It's a problem that we have since rationality, like since enlightenment.
Yeah.
That we really rush into things. We really rush into, and you can say, well, look, people are suffering from this dysfunction. People are dying. People are being, their money is being taken away, and that's true. But to find the solution, I think this has to do with capitalism, with patriarchy, to sort of allow it again to, I'm going to use that word, to penetrate us, to say, well, historically, 50 years from now or 100 years from now, hopefully we still have history books, and they're going to say, yeah, people at that time lived with great uncertainty and with the end of one system and the rising of another. And it's okay to just say, well, okay, so that's the situation. That's what's going on. And maybe if we'll do that, we'll get something like Jewish Life, which is just the right response using your skill in a way that is creative and really helping other people.
But that's what I was going to ask you about as you were describing that, because I feel like that's not what I did, I mean, I have two questions about what you're just saying, because number one was that we did rush to act, right? And in a way, like part of me feels like, I mean, I'm not at all, like, I think we absolutely have done the right thing here, but like I could imagine that somebody might have said, and probably maybe a lot of people who didn't create Jewish Life did say, okay, so there's not going to be any Jewish life experiences for a few weeks. That's fine, whatever. We'll make it through. We'll have them again in a few months. It's not going to be a disaster. Whereas, like that wasn't my attitude. My attitude was like, we can solve this. Let's and a lot of people's attitude is doing that for their own communities, right? A lot of communities have gone online, and a major difference for us was that we said, how can we actually not only solve a problem, but how can we take advantage of an opportunity not for us, but for people, in saying that there are all these amazing things happening in New York that if you were in Oklahoma, you would never be able to access. And now all of a sudden they're doing it all online. So let's make a way for the people in Oklahoma to actually participate in the things that are going on in New York. So in that sense, we could actually make this whole situation better. But that's not sitting with it quietly and, letting it wash over us for a few weeks and kind of, and the other piece that I was wondering about how you think about it is just like, it does feel like the capacity to sit and let it wash over us is a high level Maslow's hierarchy of needs possibility, right? I mean, if I need money to buy my meal tomorrow, then I have less capacity to do that than somebody who might have lost a third of their wealth over the last few weeks, but still has the other 2/3 and can kind of know that like they're not going to go hungry, and so at least, right? So I don't know how to sit with that exactly.
Sure. So the privilege stuff, like, it's not about time. It's not about, well, you should have set a week and meditated, and then you would get the solution. It can happen very, very quickly sometimes. And it's also not about inaction. And I think there's a useful concept of something called Wu Wei, which is, it's a Chinese concept of actionless action. And there's, what's the name of the guy with the quote? He said that sort of the emperor should be kind of like the sun, where the stars revolve around you. The world revolves around you. It's very narcissistic in that way. Let the world revolve around you. But what that actually means, and I think Jewish Life is a good example. The most important stuff that we do in our lives, we do it from a place that we have very little control of. We don't, like, you would think that people who get married, like I'm married, the things that you work, like your work and your marriage and your biggest life decisions, you would think that people in our society would have really sort of complicated Excel sheets where you would say, well, if I marry that girl, this is her plus side, and this this is where it doesn't work. But that's not how it works, right? The bigger the decision, it seems
Mhm.
that the less we can sort of consciously analyze it.
Hmm.
So what I'm suggesting is not about not doing anything, and it's not about spending a lot of time necessarily thinking. It's more a sort of a switch in your head of allowing reality to kind of hit you, and then maybe instantly do something. But crucially, allow reality to hit you. Like don't, because our
Mhm.
preconceived
Mhm.
concepts will usually stop reality.
Mhm.
And it has a lot to do with accepting pain, or allowing pain, not even accepting it.
I get, like I'm curious about like how you do this in your life because you do it a lot more and I think a lot more well than I do. And I'm wondering, but you're also very productive. Like you
Try to be.
or you get things done. I don't know, like you get things done, I think. And meaning like I don't think that you're just sitting with it and just kind of like, I guess my point is there a way to kind of compartmentalize and say, and I think like for example, people who meditate or people who do even religious practice, maybe in the best of circumstances, it's a way of saying, I'm going to take the next hour to live in that world and in that experience.
Mhm.
And that's going to enable me to live the rest of my day in the other experience, the experience
Mm.
of being productive. And so I don't have to say, let me take, um, let me take, 3 weeks to let the feelings kind of wash over me, and then I'll see what I can do.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm doing that kind of, I forget what the word is in computing, where you kind of do it in a kind of um, like simultaneous way, but it's because it's not actually happening simultaneously in a computer. It's actually just happening on two parallel tracks. And so, but sometimes it's more dominant than other times. I mean, is that how you think about it?
Well, for me, meditation, I tried it a lot. It was, I mean, it's always nice, but I really couldn't bring myself to do it on a regular basis. And what worked better for me was sort of in everyday life to continuously do it. So after this, I'm going to do a little more work, and I'm going to go home. And my wife is there, my daughters are there. Um, and then, stuff happens, like as always when you interact with people. And then what I try to do, and just to be clear, it doesn't work for me like 70% of the time, but I got to 30%, which is, for me, is like if I have, I don't know, a fight with my daughter or with my wife, and then I allow myself to feel the pain. I allow, and it's really real, and it's usually like it's a small thing. Like I'll be sitting watching Netflix, and my wife would tell me, "Come on, go like help me with dinner for the girls." And then like the challenge is for me to be able to say, um, either no, I want to watch 10 more minutes of this and then I'll come, or yeah, you know what? Yeah, I'm going to come. I'm going to help. And I think it's incredibly like difficult to do this, to really do this very basic thing, as opposed to sort of just operating automatically.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, the wife is saying this and the daughters are saying this, and and this is sort of the everyday practice.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's incredibly difficult. I can say like I've built like relatively big projects and sort of did all stuff, external stuff that seems meaningful, but I found it much more difficult to really listen and to really be.
Well, I think that this is our pilot episode of this, and we said we would go for 50 minutes, and we're about 5 minutes before the end of that. And I want to just say, like, this doing this show is your idea, and I'm thrilled to be doing it. I mean, both the concept about talking about somehow current events, but in a more in a way that's getting at deeper stuff. I think it's helpful for me, and I think it's going to be helpful for others. So I'm really excited to be doing this, and we're going to hopefully do it every week around the same time. We're still figuring out all our scheduling on Jewish Life, but it seems good. Um, I guess I just wanted to let you have the, to tell us, like, is there a way that you want to close over our last 5 minutes? Is there a way that something that you really want to talk about?
Well, let me do a shameless plug first and say that we just uploaded a new YouTube channel. It's called Fear of Isaac. And if you look for it in YouTube, you can find it. It's really new. We have like 10 subscribers, and I want to thank them. Where we talk about stuff like that, like the sort of stuff that we talk here, maybe from a different angle. And I don't think I have any particular message other than speak with other people and be in the world if you can. So that's what helps me.
Yeah. I mean, I think that what's weird about this time is that it's funny, like we just, we release a new episode of the Judaism Unbound podcast every week. And we actually pre-recorded our episode that's going up tomorrow a couple of weeks ago because I was getting ready to go on a trip to California. And then all of a sudden, I think it was like the next day or 2 days later, the whole thing came crashing down, and on the one hand, we don't have time to record a new episode. It was actually a really good one. Like, it was us talking about thinking more creatively about Passover, but it was in all kinds of ways that I think there's a lot of creative thinking to do about Passover right now, but it's very different creative thinking. And but so and then when we listen to it, we have a kind of a chipper tone, and it's just like we didn't know. I mean, it's like it's being recorded just before the Titanic hits the iceberg. It's like it was like a podcast being recorded, and yet it sort of felt like it was something that we wanted to release. We didn't have time to record another one, so I did like a little bit of a re-recorded intro where I just sort of said, like, this is what's going on, this is what it was. I don't know. We don't exactly know how to be and how to think and how to talk in a time like this. It's like, I don't think that Jewish life should be, and it's not, coronavirus all the time. Like, the point of it is that because of the coronavirus, we're here, but now let's talk about everything in ways that that will just make sense in this period. But we don't have to be talking about it all the time. And yet there's just going to be a growing amount of fear and tragedy and sadness, and so I feel like we're going to have to figure out that multitasking. We're going to have to figure out how to do both at the same time, because if we can only, if we live only in that fear and in that sadness, then I worry it's like a depression. It's like it just to talk about the sort of the spiritual side. I mean, it's not good for a person, and I think it's not good for society to be so caught up in a tragedy that you spiral into a depression, and yet to not feel it is also psychologically unwell. And so how do you do that, and how do you do them both intensely? So I'm looking to learn from you also, because I feel like you've been trying to do this in different ways for the last couple of years at least, and you talk about it more freely and comfortably, and I'm really excited and glad for myself, and also for folks that are watching, that maybe we'll have a chance to process some of this in the weeks ahead and
Thanks, Dan.
do better.
That was really beautiful. And I want to thank you for Jewish Love and for Judaism Unbound and for all of your work. It's if people who watch this don't know it yet, just look up Dan Libenson. You're going to find good stuff. That's it. No more compliments.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Well, we will end this show for today, and we'd love to hear from feedback from folks, whether in the Facebook comments or I guess I'll say that you can email me at dan@judaismunbound.com if you have thoughts, and I'll share them with Yehonatan. We're all building this. It's amazing to do live TV because there's no second takes. This is all live, and we are figuring this out as we go along, as we all are. So I think it's going to be an interesting time capsule also to watch, on TV, how people because I think we may have a very different tone in a couple of weeks. We may have different ideas. So I think it's going to be an interesting ride, and sort of welcome to the wilderness with us. Welcome to the Stone News. I mean, next time we'll have to talk about what that means exactly.
Yeah.
All right. So thanks, Yehonatan, and thanks everybody, and we'll be back next week.